Hi everyone. I'm Jennifer Tuttle. I'm director of the Maine Women Writers Collection here at the University of New England. I'm really happy to see some familiar names among the participants and welcome all of those whom I don't know. On behalf of the Maine Women Writers Collection, myself and our acting curator, Kathleen Miller, as well as on behalf of the University of New England, I welcome you to tonight's panel presentation on mid-century Maine women writers. We at the Maine Women Writers Collection are ourselves mere settlers in what is Wabanaki territory. We are humble and mindful that we hold this conversation today on land where Micmac, Maliseet, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy people have lived from the beginning and remain today as protectors of the land and waters. As many of you know, the Maine Women Writers Collection is a special library collection founded in 1959 to preserve and make available the cultural production of Maine women, all terms generously defined. Geographically, our holdings concern the state of Maine, Dawnland, the traditional territory of Wabanaki people, and the northern New England region. We collect the work of anyone who identifies as female, femme, trans feminine, or non-binary. And while many of the people included in the collection would self-identify as authors, many others are writers of unpublished material, such as letters and producers of other forms of creative work. We welcome students and researchers, currently through remote access, and someday, hopefully soon, in person once again. Highlighting the work of three Maine women writers, this evening's panel will explore how these women engage with Maine as place and with the social constructs of the mid-century period. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Lisa Botchin for inviting us to collaborate on this project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'd also like to acknowledge Domna Gaddis at the University of Maine at Augusta for all she's done to help us promote today's event, and to thank Lee Cody and Dave D'Adiego in UNE's communications office for making it possible for us to deliver this event virtually. And finally, we're grateful to the UNE Women's and Gender Studies program and the Departments of English and History and Philosophy, now in the School of Arts and Humanities, for co-sponsoring this event. So in a moment, Lisa is going to say a few words, and after that, I will introduce the presenters. Each speaker will present in turn, and we will hold all questions for the end. If you're watching today through the webinar that you registered for, you may enter questions for the speakers into the Q&A field at any time. Those will just accumulate, and then we will pose the questions in the order they are received at the end. And also, please note that after the third speaker has finished and before the Q&A, we will take a 5-minute stretch break before resuming the program, which will end promptly at 7 p.m. And now I'd like to turn things over to Lisa Botchin.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am so very delighted for the opportunity to be working with the folks at the Maine Women Writers Collection. Jennifer Tuttle and Kathleen Miller have been so instrumental to my own work on Maine Women Writers, and pretty clearly the seed for this event was planted in the Portland archives in the summer of 2012, when I first discovered and became entranced by their trove of materials. The Maine Women Writers Collection is truly magical and important, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. Today's event comes to you in not quite the form that we originally intended, as you may imagine. We've been distracted by other issues, including a global pandemic and this week's presidential election, and Maine's bicentennial has been easy to put to the side. But the bicentennial provides a unique opportunity to examine the state's cultural history and to cultivate discussions about some of the people who gave rise to what we now know as Maine. Last year, I was awarded a grant to create 15 events around the state that highlight a variety of the makers who helped define Maine for the nation in the middle of the 20th century and for ourselves. Our first event was a community read of Louise Dickinson Rich's They Took to the Woods. It was led by historian Candace Keynes and held at the Maine State Library on a cold Tuesday evening in January, and it was truly splendid. Little did we know then, though, that we would not be able to meet again in person for the rest of the year and beyond. Only 2 of the remaining 14 events will be taking place in 2020. This one, thanks to the stalwart efforts of my colleagues here, and one next week, a screening of the 1949 social problem film Lost Boundaries, which is about a Black doctor who passes as white in a New England hospital. And that's going to be in partnership with the Maine Historical Society. It's going to be streamed next Thursday, November 12th at 7 p.m. Also free and open to the public. And if we are able to make other events happen next year, they will be posted on the UMA website. If you look at uma.edu/mid-century, you should find out more information as we are able to provide it. So I will conclude here by truly thanking Jennifer Tuttle and Kathleen Miller for their extraordinary support and collegiality, and Ellen Taylor, Joe Conforti, and Susan Tomlinson, even though Susan can't be here tonight, for their investment in this project and for their great flexibility. Domna Giaddis for marketing the heck out of this event, Candace Keynes for picking up the balls when I dropped them, Natasha Goldman for her grant writing expertise, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is picking up tonight's tab. Thank you too very much to Lee and Dave at UNE for making all of this happen for the webinar.
So we are very fortunate to have tonight with us 3 illustrious, incredibly valuable experts and scholars on this subject of mid-century Maine women writers, among many other things. So I'm really honored to be in your company. I'll just introduce them in the order in which they're going to present. So the first presenter is Dr. Ellen M. Taylor, who is professor of English at the University of Maine at Augusta, where she teaches creative writing, literature, and women's and gender studies. Taylor is also a poet and has published 2 collections of poetry, Floating and Compass Rose, as well as a chapbook, Humming to Snails. She's published work on the influence of Elizabeth Coatsworth on her daughter Kate Barnes's poetry, and her research interests include women poets more generally. She's currently looking at ecofeminist readings of poet and essayist Celia Thaxter. Next will be Dr. Joseph Conforti, who was the founding director of the much beloved graduate program in American and New England Studies at the University of Southern Maine. He retired from USM in 2011 as Distinguished Professor Emeritus. He's the author of 8 books and edited and contributed to another. His 2001 study, Imagining New England, Explorations of Regional Identity from the Pilgrims to the Mid-20th Century, published by the University of North Carolina Press, won the Northeast Popular Culture American Culture Association's Book Award. His most recent book is Hidden Places, Maine Writers on Coastal Villages, Mill Towns, and the North Country, out in 2020. And finally, Dr. Lisa Botchin is a longtime friend of the Maine Women Writers Collection, the organizer of today's panel, and a last-minute replacement for Susan Tomlinson, who is not able to present today, but who will be back to share her research on Ruth Moore sometime in the future, and we'll be sure to let you know. So a professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Maine at Augusta, Lisa Botchin is currently working on a monograph on mid-century Maine women writers. Her essay on Louise Dickinson Rich is forthcoming in Legacy, a Journal of American Women Writers. Last year, she won a $100,000 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to stage a 15-event program on mid-century Maine writers and artists in commemoration of this year's state bicentennial, which she referred to before. And this panel, of course, is a part of that. Next week, in partnership with the Maine Historical Society, I'll just remind you again that she'll be screening the 1949 social problem film Lost Boundaries. And that event, too, will be free and open to the public. So now I will turn it to Ellen, and look forward to hearing what everyone has to say.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to actually share my screen here. And thanks again to Lisa Botchin for organizing this panel and many others to celebrate Maine's extraordinary literary history. And thanks to everyone at the Maine Women Writers Collection at UNE for hosting us, although we are at a distance. Oh, and thanks again to our tech support there behind the proverbial curtain. So when asked to speak about Elizabeth Coatsworth for this event, I decided to focus on the UNE archival findings as they relate to Coatsworth's travels in the Far East and those influences on her celebrated children's book, The Cat Who Went to Heaven, published in 1930 and still in print, by the way, anyone thinking about a holiday gift. This book foreshadows Coatsworth's prolific literary output, many of her books written about Maine and all of them written subsequent to this in Maine. I'll begin by sharing a bit about Coatsworth's quite colorful childhood, her travels, and then move to her words, including a few of her travel letters and experiences that influenced The Cat Who Went to Heaven. This book is exemplary of her writing as it illustrates her interest in the East, in mysticism, and her poetic ear and eye. These focal points forecast themes in all of her later work. Just not getting this, hang on a second here. Okay. So, although she lived much of her adult life in Maine, Elizabeth was from away. Born into a privileged family of grain merchants in Buffalo, New York in 1893, she was the youngest of two daughters, and her parents, William and Ida, were intrepid travelers. Elizabeth was only 5 when the family went abroad for 8 months, traveling through Europe and as far east as Egypt. In this photo, we see her in her Japanese kimono, taken during this journey. And I've included this quote here from Coatsworth's memoir, Personal Geographies, where she writes, "One's past is not something we leave behind, but something we incorporate. Outwardly, I am 83 years old, but inwardly, I am every age with the emotions and experiences of every period." Like nested dolls, Coatsworth embodies her past experiences and her observations in her writing. Coatsworth was at Vassar when her father died in 1912. Here we see 2 photographs of her at this time. And following her father's untimely death, her mother took Elizabeth and Meg, the 2 girls, on an extended trip of 18 months, traveling as far east as Japan, China, and the Philippines with 24 coolies, as she writes. And here I'm going to show you a few excerpts of her letters found in the Maine Women Writers Collection, which is such a goldmine for her work. This first one, I'll zoom in a bit here. She writes, "Dear Ida and Nellie and George and Frank," this is her grandmother, her aunts, and her uncles, "we're perfectly delighted. We've had an earthquake and a breathtaking 3 days on precipitous trails, hardly roads at all, to the blue volcanoes. We've seen jugs and fruits and alligators' flesh being sold at markets. The whole tribe wear clothes like rainbows. The altars of the churches and little towns are made of silver." I won't read the whole thing, but towards the bottom, she says, "We haven't had one quarrel either, but a few fleas. But what's a flea? This is all very exciting. With love indeed from the little hell cat, Betty. In the next letter, which I'll read, I don't have the screen, but I put up a few images because it comes from the Philippines. He writes again to Grandma, Aunt Nellie, Uncle George's, and Frank. Do any of you know what happiness is? You poor things, this is it. Margaret and I and an ex-soldier with 2 Filipinos, 5 ponies, and 5 men who carry on their heads our baggage are off for 10 days into the interior, along glorious mountain trails kept up by the Thai government, penciled along the sides of 2,000-foot sheer mountainsides. And the letter drops off and picks up later from Hong Kong. And she writes, oh, that letter started some time ago, but the trip was more than you can dream of. Through pines and oaks covered with pale green moss and orchards, and tree ferns with their curled fronds like the arms of long, pale apes. Towards the 4th day, we dropped from our 8,000-foot height and came to the rice fields on the mountainsides and to the little villages of the headhunters. We used to meet them along the trail with their hair caught up in gaskets on the back of their heads, their ears hanging nearly to their shoulders, sometimes with gold earrings and a bright G-string along their waists, always grinning. How far do you think we got on our ponies in 10 days? How far did we get, you contemptuous males? Well, I'll tell you, over 200 miles by the government signposts. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. So from these excerpts, we get a sense of this witty, adventurous, and observant young woman who pays attention to her surroundings and the people she meets along the way. She doesn't want to travel first class. She'd rather have a pony or a mule and sleep in a hammock. So although she grew up in relative comfort, this sense of adventure and joy of rusticity prepared her well for her simply chosen life at Chimney Farm in Damariscotta. Here are a few pictures of her in Japan on this trip. During these travels, she discovered her love for writing, and particularly poetry, which she describes as an addiction like drink. This central photo became the cover of her first book of poetry, Fox Footprints, published in 1929, which shows her interest in Eastern mysticism. Yet her venture into children's literature happened by accident. Home from her trip, she was visiting a Vassar classmate, Louise Seaman, at Macmillan, who had been given, quote, the first children's book department in the world, end of quote. And she showed Elizabeth a story, one of the first that she had accepted, which was a retelling of a Navajo myth, to which Elizabeth replied, oh, that's not much good. So her friend proposed she'd do something better. This became her first book, which was The Cat and the Captain, published in 1927. She had an interest in cats, we can see here. The next book was The Cat Who Went to Heaven, winner of the 1931 Newbery Medal. Now this book merits a brief overview. It starts, well, it tells the story of this poor Japanese artist, we see him on the cover here on the left, who sends his housekeeper out with his last few coins to buy food. But instead, he brings home a cat. Now the painter is not happy with this choice. However, he's consoled when he looks closer and he says, quote, oh, a 3-colored cat. They are very lucky, I understand. She is like a white flower on which butterflies of 2 kinds have alighted. So we can see her use of poetic analogy here. The behavior of the cat, whom the housekeeper calls good fortune, wins over the painter. He notices that the cat often spends hours before the image of the Buddha, which we see in one of these covers here, and he witnesses her catch and then release a small bird. What mercy, he writes, why, she is more virtuous than a priest. So good fortune brings just that. Soon after her arrival, the painter is offered commission by the priest at the local temple. And he is to paint a picture of the dying Buddha with animals who come to pay homage to him. The priest gives the painter a large sum of money as first payment to, quote, relieve your mind of worry while you work, end of quote. The artist meditates on the life of the Buddha before painting each scene and each visiting animal. And towards the end of the painting, the painter becomes conflicted because he cannot represent the cat on the scroll because, quote, of all the animals, the cat refused to accept the teachings of the Buddha. She alone of all creatures was not blessed by him, end of quote. Yet when the painting is completed, good fortune laid her round little head against his breast and mewed like a crying child, end of quote. So the painter acquiesces. He took up his best brush, dipped it in spring water, touched it with ink, and last of all, drew a cat in the bottom corner of the painting. We see the whole scroll here, and the cat. On seeing her feline image, alas, good fortune dies of joy. So the painting is delivered, and initially it's praised by the village chief priest until he notices the presence of the cat in the lower right-hand corner. He says, this cat must suffer for her obstinacy and you from yours. So they decide they will burn the painting in the morning. However, morning brings news of a miracle where the cat's image had been, quote, was now only white silk that seemed never to have felt the touch of ink, end of quote. And where the Buddha had been reclining with his arms folded, now, quote, stretched out an arm in blessing, and under the holy hand knelt the figure of a tiny cat with pretty white head bowed in happy adoration, end of quote. That image is actually not illustrated in the book, so it's left to our imagination. But thus concludes the tale. So Coatsworth effectively rewrites this alleged Buddha superstition regarding cats and employs her own version of magic realism to do so. I mean, other themes of mercy, compassion, and sacrifice are clear. In an article on writing for children, published in the Writer magazine in November of 1931, Coatsworth gives this sage advice, quote, the person who writes good children's books is one who retains within himself strong elements of his own childhood, unchanged in spite of their being overlaid by layers of adultness, end of quote. As she went on to write almost 100 children's books, we can surmise that she maintained a healthy inner child. Another area she discusses in this article is the appeal of repetition to children. Quote, the thing upon which all tribal chants and tales and ballads and even choruses of popular songs are built, end of quote. Coatsworth's training as a poet serves her well in this use of repetition, as well as image and rhyme. So she ends each chapter in the book with a poem. They're titled The Songs of the Housekeeper. They vary in length and pattern, but they all have a rhyme scheme, and they serve to punctuate each chapter with the housekeeper's voice. The book itself ends with this 8th song of the housekeeper, so we can say she actually had the last word. Upon the news of the Newbery Medal, Coatsworth cringed. In a letter she writes, under a shadow of dread about the presentation itself, end of quote. The series of lunches and dinners, she later wrote, when the brief interlude was over, it's one more adventure to add to the others, this time a very social one, where the best ones are solitary. So she's really more at home on a picnic in the forest then at a lunch at the Ritz. So in closing, The Cat Who Went to Heaven illustrates the influence of Coatsworth's travels in the Far East, but also her fascination with mysticism and her poetic training, the lore of story, of exploring the what if, the territory of the imagination, which led to almost 100 books and decades of writing joy for Elizabeth Coatsworth. She writes in her memoir, quote, "In the Far East, there is no harsh line drawn between the real and the apparent. The thing seems, but who knows but that it is," end of quote. Let me briefly just comment on how this book also laid the groundwork for her other writing in and about Maine. She moved to Damariscotta in 1932 with her new husband, Henry Beston, and they joined other literary rusticators who left comfortable homes in urban and suburban homes to find renewal in nature. While Henry was interested in the simple life, Elizabeth was also charmed by her quirky Maine community, and she focused on this aspect in much of her later work. For example, in Maine Memories, published in 1944, the neighborhood stories she writes about are really stranger than fiction. She includes a story about a group of Eskimos who were discovered on an ice floe off the coast, who then winter in an abandoned cellar until spring, about a baby seal who's locally adopted and who flipper flops up to his foster home every day for lunch, about abandoned fox cubs who winter with a family along with a pair of rabbits until they're released in the spring. So she's clearly drawn, as we can see from all these titles and their illustrations, clearly drawn to stories of animals and unlikely relationships, to magic and the transformation of the ordinary. In all of this, her early travels and her fascination with the exotic prepared her for a contented life in Maine with the wilderness of her imagination. So if we take her advice and keep our childhood's suspension of disbelief, we may one day wake to find the cats of our dreams have left their paw prints behind. So thanks again to Lisa, Kathleen Miller, and Jefferson Navicki, who helped me in the archives, and to everyone at Maine Women Writers Collection. I'll pass the talking stick next to Joe Conforti.
Thank you, Ellen. So thanks to Lisa for inviting me to participate in this panel. Thanks to Jennifer for the very, very generous introduction. I didn't expect to hear all that stuff about my past. And thanks to Kathleen Miller for all of the support she gave me when I was working on my most recent book and probably my last book. So I spent a lot of time at the Maine Women Writers Collection. I really appreciate all the help Kathleen Miller gave me. So I'm going to talk about Mary Ellen Chase. Her dates are 1887 to 1973. And the way I see her is as a mediator between Sarah Orne Jewett and Ruth Moore, who wrote starkly realistic novels about Maine island life and Maine coastal communities, beginning in the mid-1940s and continuing into the 1960s. Chase was probably the first major Maine writer who lived under the shadow of Sarah Orne Jewett. In 1962, after she retired from teaching for decades at an elite college, women's college, and after she had published 30 books, she was still doling out the praise to Sarah Orne Jewett as she had throughout her life. She said, "All Maine writers, without exception, look upon the flawless work of Sarah Orne Jewett with an admiration approaching reverence. All of us realize only too keenly that at our best, we are not worthy to unloose the latchet of her shoes. That's incredibly extravagant. And I think one of the interesting things about her reverence for Sarah Orne Jewett is that Jewett seemed to have very, very little, if any, influence on her writing. In part, that's because Chase lived at a different historical and political moment from Jewett, and she had different cultural and literary needs. And what I mean by that is that Chase did her best Maine work during the depths of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And I'll talk a little bit more about what she wrote in those decades and in that decade and how it was received. But I guess I would like to start by enumerating what I think are her significant contributions to Maine literature. First, I would say that Chase was the first major Maine novelist to write acerbically about what she saw summer people doing to coastal communities, to Maine people, and to the material heritage of Mainers that was being plundered. Secondly, I would say that no one to date, neither novelist nor historian, has told the story of the devolution of coastal Maine, down East Maine, from clippers to canneries to colonies of summer people. No one has done it in such detail and with such literary skill. And finally, I would say a third contribution has to do with what remains permanent in down East Maine. And that is the stunning beauty of that stretch of Maine coast. She captured the aesthetic allure of down East nature, so that I would say she made a contribution to writing about coastal Maine. Let me go a little bit into her background before I move forward with her accomplishments. As I said, she was born in 1887. She was a native of Blue Hill, Maine. During the 80s, Blue Hill lost 10% of its population. It continued to lose population in significant numbers until during the decade after she left Blue Hill, 1911 to 1920, the town lost 20% of its population. Now, granted, summer people were coming in, but they were not year-round residents they went there to replace the year-round residents who were leaving. Chase attended the University of Maine. When she enrolled initially, she was among 20 young women who joined a school of 500 students. She graduated from the University of Maine, and then she moved to the Midwest and taught girls in girls' schools. And then she made her way to the University of Minnesota, where she earned a PhD in English. In 1926, she joined the faculty of Smith College, where she would become one of those popular teachers, if not the most popular teacher in Smith's I would say in Smith's history. She also became popular as a public speaker across the country. I assume that some of those speaking engagements were the result of the influence of Smith graduates who had become leaders in communities, leaders of women's groups, and who arranged to have her come. Now, during the Depression, she had a very, very productive career, a very successful career as a writer. In 1932, she published the first of what would be 3 memoirs. A Goodly Heritage is probably her best, not probably, it is her best memoir. And she thanks the gods for allowing her to be born and to grow up in Blue Hill, Maine. But of course, the town was losing year-round population, as I've already said, so that there's a discrepancy in all the odes to Blue Hill that she wrote in her 3 memoirs and what was actually happening on the ground, where a small town of about 2,000 people was losing year-round residents by the decade. I think one can explain that partly by understanding that she came from a privileged family. Her father was a lawyer with a practice both in Blue Hill and in Ellsworth. Her mother had taught Latin at Blue Hill Academy. Her family had a long history of being seafarers. In fact, her grandmother had gone to sea with her husband, and she told young Mary Ellen Chase of all of her adventures at sea, or of a lot of her adventures at sea. She regaled her with stories. So 2 years after A Goodly Heritage was published, drawing on what her grandmother had told her, and also on her extensive research, she published Mary Peters, an account of a family in the twilight of worldwide seafaring. It's set between 1880 and about 1920. And then the next year, 1935, she published what is considered her best book, Silas Crockett, which examines the history of Down East from about 1930 to 1931. And then in 1939, she published another memoir. All of these works, A Goodly Heritage 32, Mary, but I've lost her name. Mary, how did I do that? It happens when you retire. Mary Peters and Silas Crockett they were all bestsellers, as well as Windswept, which was published in 1941. So it was in the Depression that she really made her reputation. I can't talk about all of her contributions to Maine literature that I've suggested. So I'm going to concentrate on one, namely the way in which summer people, in her view, were creating a new Maine that was destroying tradition and tearing people away from their maritime past and from some connection and appreciation of that past. Consider what Peters and Mary Peters' mother encounters in Petersport after a 3-year voyage at sea. The town was astir with the emergence of a summer economy. Mrs. Peters laments, there was something immeasurably sad at the sight of a grandson of a shipmaster in the foreign trade, shingling the roof of a summer cottage for a livelihood. And she goes on, even sadder was how summer strangers knew little and cared less about that boy's history. Well, in fact, the locals were participating in separating themselves from that history. Mary Peters talks about boys who forsook going to a nearby teachers' college to become painters and masons and caretakers and other activities for summer people. So she's laying out this outline of how summer people are eroding the history and the culture of communities that are usually in her fiction stand-ins for Blue Hill. Some Mainers have a different economic relationship with summer people. They're so desperate that they sell off part of their material heritage to summer visitors or city agents who are in hunting for valuable antiques, artifacts from the pre-industrial periods, from the age of homespun, handmade things, furniture, portraits, artifacts of all sorts. And so she sees this as a kind of pillaging of the material artifacts that connect Mainers to the past. She not only deals with this in Mary Peters, but she addresses it in Silas Crockett as well. And Silas Crockett, as I've already suggested, takes place on a much larger canvas than Mary Peters. It is the story of what happened to Down East over a century. And I don't have time to talk about Silas Crockett in detail, but I just want to say something about the introduction to the novel and the conclusion of the novel, because I think they're both exceptionally well done, and they are completely different in the effect they have on the reader. In the case of the beginning of Silas Crockett is a 22-year-old son of the prominent seafaring family, the Crocketts, of Saturday Cove, Maine. He is the last male upholding the tradition of the family of sending out people to sail around the world. His two brothers have been lost at sea. At 22, he's already the captain of a ship aptly named the Seven Seas. He's just returning from a nearly 2-year voyage around the world. And he's on a steam tug going from Bath down east to Saturday Cove. And it really is a primitive steam tug, and it travels very, very slowly, but it gives him an opportunity to see Maine at the height of its sailing and shipbuilding days. And so he describes all the activity in all the coves and bays along the coast. There are ships at all different stages of construction. He hears the pounding of the mallet. He sees piles of sawdust from all the wood that's been cut to build the ship. He sees canvas being stretched out. He sees cladding, copper cladding being attached to the bottom of a boat. He hears the sounds of workers yelling for things. He hears the yells of boys on shore excited about seeing the construction of this ship. And so it's a wonderfully done presentation of what the coast of Maine, down East Maine, would have looked like at the high point of the age of sail. One other thing that happens on this short journey, and I'm going to be very, very brief. The captain of the steam tug is this slovenly man who still has part of his breakfast on his beard. And he tries to engage Silas Crockett in a debate about the future of sailing versus the power of steam to eclipse the age of sail. And he just keeps coming at Silas Crockett, and Silas Crockett, in all of his dignity and haughtiness, just lets the man bray, although he does respond briefly after the man has baited him into a discussion. But he has no doubts about the age of sailing continuing far into the future. It's really quite well done, and it really engages the reader. And then I want to go to the end of the book with the fourth generation of Crockett's in 1931. They've already sold off many possessions. They've even had to give up the Crockett homestead. They're so desperate. The family moves down east toward the canneries, toward what we might call Maine's Cannery Row. And Silas Crockett II, the great-grandson of Silas Crockett we meet in the first chapter, drops out of Bowdoin and considers going into the cannery to help his desperate family. So the manager of a cannery factory tries to persuade him to join the workforce. Silas is really hesitating. And the manager says that Silas should take the job like a gull diving for herring refuse. He goes on to say a number of other things. This business is about all that keeps the coast alive just now, except for the rusticators that are losing their money and are bound to lose more. Silas is still not persuaded. And so the manager trots out one argument, a racial argument. And he says, there are no workers here who are, quote, Canucks, Italians, or even Irish. They're fine coast of Maine stock. Silas II finally capitulates and enters the cannery. It represents the final fall of the House of Crockett. And it's among the more powerful scenes, and there are many powerful scenes in Silas Crockett. I'm going to end on just one point, namely that some critics, some New York critics, accused Chase of romanticizing the past that would never return. And her response was that she was a realist, that she had done a great deal of research before she wrote her novels. Yes, she was a realist, but she was also a moralist. And in some respects, she bears a relationship to the proletarian writers of the 1930s, though she was certainly not a proletarian writer. But I think she's connected to them by this. She saw her work as interventions in the course of the state of affairs down east. That is what she was attempting to do with her novels, and she had didactic purpose, was to rekindle down east Mainers' awareness of and pride in their maritime past. And I think I'm going to end on that note.
Thank you, Joe. There's a lot of food for thought there, and also with Ellen's great talk about Elizabeth Coatsworth. And I am writing about Mainers, women writers in Maine who would definitely be considered from away, and maybe even part of those dreaded summer colonists that Joe was just talking about. So I'll look forward to our conversation. But I did want to just, one little point of reference there. Joe, I don't know if you've read Eleanor Graham, our Way Down East, who's writing at the same time as all of these other writers that we're talking about in the 30s and 40s and beyond. And she actually is one of those collectors of antiques and artifacts that are being sold by Mainers. She is originally from Maryland, and she's living in Freeport on a saltwater farm, which still exists. And I wonder if actually some of these people from away are guarding and collecting parts of the Maine past that Mary Ellen Chase is worried about. But we can talk about that after. I will now be talking about Catherine Butler Hathaway, who wrote The Little Locksmith. And this is, actually, I'm just going to show you the title page here, which is very pretty. And also, I think probably one of the most moving memoirs that I've ever read, which is why I wrote about it. So I'm just going to share my screen. And tell you a little bit about this memoir and talk about how I see her, Catherine Butler Hathaway, using Maine as a liberatory space. So the first excerpt of this memoir, which, as I said, published in 1943, came out in the Atlantic Monthly the year before, and immediately created a fan base that lasted for years after her death, which unfortunately occurred shortly after that excerpt was made public. So she never even really got to see her book come to light. And it was about the ways in which she, who had been indelibly marked by spinal tuberculosis as a child, was able to liberate herself from conservative ideas about female autonomy, sexuality, and art through the purchase of a house in Castine. And that was, her work was incredibly resonant. So, and I think in this way, she shares a lot in common with both the other writers whom we've talked about this evening, but particularly maybe with Elizabeth Coatsworth, who, like herself, was a cosmopolitan person from away, but who actually made Maine her full-time home when she could, in Catherine Butler Hathaway's case. So in 1924, at the age of 34, she bought the former Mark Hatch house, so one of those houses that was originally created by a sea captain that Joe was just talking about. It was, as you can see, a large white colonial. It was built in 1802, and she immediately began to restore it. And she writes, "Apparently, I'm susceptible to houses as some people are susceptible to other human beings. Twice in my life, I have fallen in love with one. Each time it was as violent and fatal as falling in love with a human being. The first time it happened was 10 years ago, and that's about this house. And that experience caused as much of an awakening in me as another person's first love affair. I bought the house, and it changed the whole of my life." She writes of her house with the language of love and eroticism. Her house in Castine is the yeast that made her life rise. And as this and other metaphors suggest, the small, thin, immunologically compromised woman that is Catherine Butler Hathaway takes a commanding and, I would argue, queer role in this relationship. Butler Hathaway is a writer prone to language of desire. Her readers become aware of her erotic feelings for a wide variety of persons, places, and things, including the little locksmith referenced in her memoir's title, her older brother, Warren, Warren's good friend, Henry Beston, who would eventually marry writer Elizabeth Coatsworth, whom Ellen just discussed, her own father, two Japanese male artists, both of whom became her lovers, her friend Catherine Huntington, who did not, and the list goes on. Dan Hathaway, the Massachusetts man, 10 years her junior, whom she ended up marrying at the age of 42, in contrast, is rarely described with words that reflect anything but a rather stolid sense of respect and admiration. And I do have Dan here. Regardless, in all of Butler Hathaway's published writings, her feelings for her house, particularly this first house that she chooses and owns by herself, and later there's another in Blue Hill, so there's another convergence with Mary Ellen Chase there, are more forcefully articulated than for any other person, place, or thing. Catherine Butler Hathaway's life and writing point to the ways that the rural can provide as complex a home as the urban, even, or perhaps particularly, after the urban has been touted as the dominant location in which a progressive person and their actions can take place. the rural town of Castine, Maine, and specifically the Mark Hatch House, becomes for Catherine Butler Hathaway a liberatory space. And the place that makes her life rise is not rural by default. Hathaway attended Radcliffe for a time. She encountered plenty of bohemian individuals in and around Cambridge. She lived in Greenwich Village in another very heady historical moment. And she decamped for Paris, lengthy Paris sojourns, at least twice. So she lived there for months at a time, once with her husband, new husband then. She's nothing if not cosmopolitan. She embarked in analysis with Isette de Forest, one of the preeminent analysts of her era. She visited the Paris atelier of artist Alexander Calder. She corresponded with Ellery Sedgwick, who was the editor of the Atlantic Monthly and who published a number of her pieces, beginning when she was only in her 20s. But it's Castine and later Blue Hill, Maine, that she longs for during these other periods. And it's where she continues to return, even after she marries, as she says, a human being, years after her initial house purchase. For Catherine Butler Hathaway, the urban, while exciting and stimulating, is ultimately exhausting and alienating. Instead, it's the creation of a rural home that allows her to be most fully herself. But it's not a rural home of tradition and patriarchal normative values. Rather, it's a home that not only functions as her erotic other, but one in which she hopes there will be many visiting nieces and nephews. She was a very dedicated aunt. Lots of art making, and plenty of sex for others as well as for herself. Butler Hathaway is what we might today call a person with disabilities. She was noticeably coy about what she looked like in her books. And also, she didn't really talk about how well she functioned physically in the world once she was released from a pretty kind of torturous treatment, which involved 10 years on a stretcher in her childhood. But her posthumously published letters reveal some clues. She notices some moments of regret and horror when she looks in the mirror. And she talks about her perceptibly small stature, describing herself as the size of a 10-year-old child. And in one scholarly book about dwarves, she is actually talked about specifically as a dwarf. The few unpublished photos in her archive suggest she was thin, wide shoulders, and quite a bit shorter than her friends. And I'll just show you. There are not that many extant photos of her. These are just a couple that were in the archive at the Schlesinger, which is where most of, actually, her papers are all over the place, quite frankly, but that's one place where they're collected. But so equally significant to the way, the way that people perceive her and she perceives herself is her physical fragility. There are moments in her life where flights of stairs are insurmountable, including one time when she must be carried up exterior steps by a hired man to enter a theater. In such circumstances, urban environments can be exhausting, and the few times she's able to live in a first-floor apartment are gratefully recounted. There are months and years in which her letters detail lengthy illnesses, pulmonary troubles, and finally, a diagnosis of myocarditis. She died at the age of 52, only able to breathe as long as she was curled up, quote, like a snail or an unborn child, unquote. In addition to these physical challenges, there was the stigma of being marked by tuberculosis, which was a disease with few cures in the early 20th century. Moreover, her status as a disabled woman may have been particularly challenging. Rosemary Garland Thompson asserts seen as the opposite of the masculine figure, but also imagined as the antithesis of the normal woman, the figure of the disabled female is thus ambiguously positioned both inside and outside the category of woman. In her memoir, Butler Hathaway asserts that she's unable to perform in ways that are traditionally feminine because of her non-normative body. When her older brother Warren brings home his college friends, including the aforementioned Henry Beston, she understands herself to fail at the skillful feminine role that would otherwise be expected of a Harvard man's sister. She lacks what she calls physical perfection of the otherwise silly girls down the street. Her disabled body rules her out as a possible love interest for Henry Beston and others of her brother's friends, making it difficult for her to claim the traditional position of woman. Instead, she reluctantly accepts a degraded position of, and this is a quote from Little Locksmith, queer little human toy, respected and beloved in a way in which no other kind of person is respected and beloved. As a mid-century writer, Butler Hathaway's understanding of the word queer has more in common with the phrase non-normative than the way it is used today to claim certain forms of gendered and sexual alterity. And yet, her sense of herself as odd or curious is distinctly tied to her gender and sexuality, creating more harmony with contemporary meaning than one might expect. Once she reaches her 30s, she comes to embrace her queer self. She writes, "I was glad I was not expected to function as a woman. I was humbly grateful that I could be impersonal and unhampered and dedicated wholly to that life-giving, fruitful joy of the artist." Her queerness prevents her from embracing many of the era-specific conventions of adult womanhood, such as childbearing and other family responsibilities. But it also allows her a certain gender fluidity that liberates her to write and draw, especially once she finds the ideal house in and with which to live and work. Moreover, her house in Castine, Maine allows her to be productively queer when Greenwich Village and expat Paris neighborhoods, where she shares mutual friends with Gertrude Stein, for example, do not. In her relentless and discerning pursuit of a house, Butler Hathaway assumes a traditionalist masculine role. The house is cast as a maiden, passively waiting to be chosen. She writes, "I became aware of houses as a man is aware of women, searching over several years for the right one to marry." But equally significant is the reflection of herself that she sees only in her Castine house. As mentioned, other references to mirror reflections convey, for the most part, her self-disgust or sadness at her image. However, as she views herself in the mirror in the Castine house, she comments, "The reflection I saw looked like a portrait of an artist by himself. I did not see a woman. It looked more like a very intelligent, gifted young boy. Nor did I see my deformity. It was not there. It had been canceled, wiped out, forgotten." Here she welcomes the opportunity to negotiate a creative space between genders that her house affords. She is more like a very intelligent, gifted young boy, a maker who, moreover, doesn't demonstrate any visible disability. The house allows her to recreate herself as a gender-fluid, able-bodied artist. Significantly, when Catherine Butler Hathaway initially begins looking for a house in Maine, she begins with the idea that as a very small, childish spinster, and those are her words, she will want a dwelling that is, quote, small, something mignon and doll-like. Thimble was the word used by me and my family to describe the thing that was supposed to be suitable, unquote. The fact that her desire leads her to purchase a large, stately colonial with views of the Penobscot Bay is something of a surprise, as it seems inconceivable that a structure so sizable and grand could well represent her compromised, diminutive stature. As Butler Hathaway sets out to restore the house's fireplaces and hand-carved doors, and this is a kind of interesting gesture toward perhaps the culture that Joe was talking about. She kind of condemns the previous owner for covering up those carvings or replacing the doors by common Sears hardware. But she reconfirms her affiliation with this house nonetheless. And it's quite striking how she does so. She writes, "And so a kind of mystic marriage in impregnation took place between me and that piece of land and the buildings that stood on it. And it was a happy marriage. From the moment when I first stepped onto those premises until the last moment when I left them, I felt a presence there, a strong, loving spirit that was always brooding over me, welcoming me and encouraging me." And again, I'm just going to reference Joe's point about the evil summer people and just say, there's maybe there's a possibility of some of them being interested in carrying on some of the traditions. The property here that we see is cast in a feminine light against the author's androgyny, serving as both a helpmeet and reproducer, although it's unclear whose body, hers or the house's, bears the impregnation of the other. Regardless, her queer relationship with this rural Castine property is manifest. Importantly, this relationship follows in the footsteps of the previous generation of New England spinsters, who were largely responsible for cultivating the regionalist movement. And here, obviously, I'm thinking of Sarah Orne Jewett, among others, Celia Thaxter, Mary Wilkins Freeman. Many of these women led somewhat unconventional domestic lives for their time. In fact, far from being odd, the notion of an unmarried, white, well-off, queer in any sense woman buying a large colonial was, according to critic J. Semaine Lockwood, essential to late 19th and early 20th century ideas of New England culture. Lockwood argues that this woman-dominated cultural mode shaped how Americans at the turn into the 20th century understood New England, which was repeatedly personified in the period as feminine and spinsterly. And it included also alternative eroticism, such as concepts like the Boston marriage. Additionally, she contends that a wide range of white middle-class women cultivated New England at this time, including vacationers, noting that women were the majority of tourists to the region. This affiliative backdrop is vital to Butler Hathaway's election of Castine as an area superior to Paris or New York, in part because of the previous generation of queer women's inroads into states like Maine and Massachusetts. She's able to conduct herself as she likes without attracting notice to her own queer needs or desires. The writer finds it normalizing to buy and restore her house as a single woman, as queer women such as historian Alice Baker had already spearheaded the historic home restoration movement just south of her in Massachusetts. She's also able to receive the vital physical help she sometimes needed in and out of cars, up steps, without requesting special accommodation because of the noticeable presence of other middle-aged and elderly women who required a class-based form of assistance that assumed an embodied fragility. In the tourist culture of early 20th century Penobscot Bay, affording support to these women was routine. For example, Butler Hathaway writes, local men could be counted on to take, quote, fragile, delicate, and important ladies anywhere at any time. And she confesses that because of her own unstable health, there were moments that she was, quote, just like the breakable old ladies. I had to be handed in and out just like them. Benefiting then from previous communities of queer New England women culture makers and current communities of women tourists, Catherine Butler Hathaway was able to marry her Castine, Maine colonial with little suspicion and plenty of support from her neighbors. And while cosmopolitan urban areas offered the stimulation and frisson of mingling with many other writers and artists, ultimately, the rural house and town of Castine, Maine were to be more nurturing, both creatively as well as physically, for a small post-tubercular person with bouts of cardiac inflammation. I had never been at home on earth the way other people were, she writes shortly before her death, but now it seemed I had found a cure for my homelessness. And it's here in small town Maine where she puts down creative and familial roots, acquires lovers, and hosts artists and writers, arguably making it new in full view of, and with approbation from, the otherwise conservative traditions of Yankee small town life. Thank you.
So thank you everyone again so much. Kathleen, I know you were going to facilitate Q&A. I'm not yet seeing any questions in there, but maybe you have some, and I'm going to turn this over to you now. But also, of course, I know all want to hear what the speakers want to ask each other. So I'll mute now and make room for Kathleen.
Okay. Well, I just want to invite people, if you're thinking about a question, put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to that. But I would like to invite the panelists, if you have questions or comments for each other, to kick us off. Maybe that'll generate some questions from the audience. Yeah, Ellen, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking, listening to both Joe and Lisa, that all three of these women, of course, had some economic privilege for them to choose their literary careers. So they have that in common. But also, Lisa, while you were talking, this idea of replacing this alleged lore of the urban cultural draw with the rural, not really at the expense of cultural opportunities, because they created them not only by their own communities, but they found, I think, cultural opportunities by investing themselves in their new communities. Like for Coatsworth anyway, she was fascinated by going to a quilting bee or barn raising or something like this. That was as exotic to her as an Eastern temple. So I feel like they weren't lacking that alleged lore that we might find in an urban place.
Yeah, I think that's right. And but also, I mean, so what there is, and I think, you know, Joe's paper kind of suggests this, is that there's the danger of, you know, these kind of outsiders coming in to consume native Maine culture without a lot of self-reflection of that power dynamic, right? So, you know, as you point out, all of these women had a certain amount of privilege and were able to kind of use that privilege to gain autonomy and to do things like, you know, hang out with their quaint, Maine neighbors. But I also think that and I know Coatsworth less, and you would have a better sense of this. I think there was real kind of authentic investment in the communities as well. I found that certainly with, I think, Catherine Butler Hathaway, Eleanor Graham, whom I referenced earlier, and then also Louise Dickinson Rich. Like, I think there's like a real desire to connect with people, to be part of the communities in real ways, to share, and not necessarily just to commodify or exoticize them. So I don't know what either of you might think of that.
Well, with respect to Mary Ellen Chase, I mean, I had a limited amount of time. We all had limited amount of time, and there's a critique one can offer of her. I mean, you suggested, Lisa, that she herself was a summer person, and she bought a property, and so she in a sense is participating in the kinds of things that she's writing about. But you know, I've written a lot about New England, and one of the things one finds is that the summer people really make contributions, not only along the lines you're talking about, Lisa, but they help establish historical societies. They participate in the preservation of their local communities. They introduce preservation into their communities. And I've written about this with respect to York and old York. So what I was trying to present is the view of an invested writer writing at the time of the Depression and expressing this outrage for a reason, but that's only half the story. One of the things I did in writing about her was I didn't buy the idea that the local people had completely separated themselves from their history. So I looked at the period 1880 to 1920, and I looked at towns down east, and I discovered that I would say a dozen or so published town histories during that period, and mostly late 19th century, early 20th century. So the story is far more complicated than Chase presents it, and there's a critique to be offered of what she has to say from a variety of angles.
I think I think both these things are happening concomitantly, right? That on the one hand, there are some folks who come from away and who are truly, invested in the new communities in which they're living, and are doing things like you're pointing out, establishing historical societies, and also preserving, as I mentioned, some of the artifacts and antiques that connect Mainers to their history. Like they become, I would say they become Mainers, but at the same time, particularly also with these books that they're writing, and this is one thing that I'm kind of working out in the book that I'm writing, is they're marketing this same Maine. And I think Elizabeth Coatsworth, I don't know, Ellen, maybe you want to speak to this. Elizabeth Coatsworth is particularly somebody who does this kind of repeatedly, because she does exoticize. This is part of her, her trade as a writer. She does exoticize the places that she goes, and she does. It seems like she truly delights in all of these places and people, but she is engaging in, one might call it primitivism, Orientalism, when she's in Asia, and so both those things are happening simultaneously. Like there's both love and commodification happening simultaneously. I don't know if Ellen, you wanted to speak to Coatsworth.
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. And I think also this continues because there's a kind of nostalgia for the simplicity of the pre-industrial life that charmed probably Coatsworth and certainly Baston. Actually, I just wanted to read this excerpt, this part of the prologue to the third edition of her Maine Memories. And she writes, and I'm reading over these chapters, I'm filled with nostalgia for those early years. A simpler world. Our garden was plowed by oxen. It was the neighbor's oxen. They never owned an ox. In those days, our neighbors on the back road still farmed their land. The serene hours were filled with work and pleasure. In the evenings, Henry would read Shakespeare while I darned socks and hemmed tea napkins. So I think there's even now, there's a nostalgia for what they thought they had lost. So part of what they were trying to reclaim was this pre-industrial simplicity that one can get when one goes to a rural community, right? And I think this still resonates today, not to go too far away from the text, but we still have this, this dichotomy between Mainers and people who from away, I'm not even talking about summer people, that's like another category, but those who are from away, if you don't have ancestors here. But the people from away often can buy land and bring money to the local library or dust off the shelves of the Historical Society or staff those spaces.
Yeah, and I think that quite frankly, there's also the sense of this mid-century period in particular, but it actually is telegraphed all the way till today. There is the way in which that this understanding of Maine ends up kind of creating a state ethos too. So again, that kind of dichotomous state ethos of both, this is, a great, you see it actually happening during the pandemic, right? Like Maine has been inundated with out-of-state buyers of property. And that, part of that is for this vision of this simpler, life that people can achieve only in, by moving to this small town. And it is a very kind of mythologized vision of life. Even for the Beston Coatsworths, whom you say, like, you're able to call them out because like she has this whole thing about all of this kind of rural life they live. But maybe you can talk a little bit about, like, didn't she have, like, they had, all sorts of help to do the work that they needed to do.
Absolutely. She came from privilege, but actually later she was able to support the family through her literary career. Those books she wrote were lucrative, those children's books and all her Sally adolescent books. So she had money coming in, but she says in an interview somewhere, she made it a point of writing enough so she never had to pick up a pan. So they had a cook and a housekeeper. And even though their house was very simple and, you can visit Chimney Farm, but she wasn't a person who kept house at all. And she also, I think it was her daughter, Kate, who said a chimney farm was a place where my parents grew only words. Henry had an herb garden. That was, his literary project, really, but they weren't farmers in any sense of the imagination, right? Yeah, they did certainly give back to the community, as you mentioned, and didn't take advantage of anyone in their community. I think they tried to fit in as best they could.
It sounds like maybe we're at a lull, so I'm just going to bring in a note from one of our viewers. Abby Close Rodigan writes, yes, it's interesting to think about how these white, relatively wealthy women wrote and defined these places and spaces in something of a folkloric manner. And then Jennifer had a question. I'm interested in the ways the subjects of your talks sketch out a relationship between Maine and the world. There's a sort of circulatory oceanic context for the work you are looking at. How does this relate to the kind of poignancy and nostalgia around rural and coastal Maine? Anybody, feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll say something that's, I think, obvious from what I've already said, but both Coatsworth and Beston, her husband, had traveled around the world, and they chose Maine because they were really interested in these rural or allegedly rural, simple ways of life. That was the draw to not flee from industrialization, but to go to that kind of quiet space in nature. And yes, this is still something that is the lore of Maine, vacation land, the way it should be, right? LL Bean and the catalogs and the flannel shirts and the boots and everything that is sort of like Maine's persona, but part of that is actually real. So it's not just a veneer. It's not just a license plate. There's an authenticity to it. And I think, true, some summer people are, I hope I don't offend any listeners here. Maybe there's some people, pandemic people, who will come and not really be invested in who we are, but folks who come and buy homes and farms and choose to live here are, I think, want the real Maine and not just the postcard of it.
But I think like these women, I mean, all of them, including Mary Ellen Chase, are all kind of creating this, right? This representation of Maine. I mean, you know, when people, you know, when people are buying houses in pandemic Maine, they are not thinking about the, you know, for example, the influx of Angolan immigrants that we've had, or like the, you know, the migrant blueberry pickers or whatever, like that. That's not part of the picture of the Maine that people, that resource people are buying. And I think so. I mean, I would submit that, as Abby is also suggesting there, that you know, these mid-century writers are helping to create / reinforce that image that, you know, that doesn't really, you know, that is a, you know, it's limited. It's a limited vision. It doesn't, as Joe points out, it doesn't necessarily, well, Mary Ellen Chase, Joe's saying, has perhaps a more more of a critique built into her representations. But even so, I would say that even if she's trafficking in realism, it is still a nostalgic one, in that she is, you know, kind of only elevating these very specific historical moments that, you know, quite frankly, we already are somewhat familiar with. Like, she's not, you know, she's not unearthing, she's not looking at, for example, you know, her Wabanaki neighbors, you know, like she's going back to Maine seafaring, which, as Joe says, is, you know, you can trace back to Jewett and, you know, beyond probably. So. I don't know, Joe, if you have any thoughts about.
Well, Chase had a complicated relationship with Maine, unlike the other writers we're talking about, because she was a native, and even though she beat a hasty retreat from Maine, I think one can explain that in the context of her biography. Her father tried to run her life. He's the one who decided she was going to go to the University of Maine. And I think she was also dealing with her sexuality. She found a life partner at Smith College, in a professor of language, classical languages and literature, and they're buried together in Blue Hill. But I would describe her not so much as a summer person as an outsider insider, someone who knew Maine from the inside, even though from a privileged perspective, and who came back because she had money from her successful novels, particularly from Windswept, which became the name of her summer home. And Maine became a kind of retreat where she could continue writing quietly. So I just think her relationship to Maine is different from the relationship of the others we're talking about. I would say this is just an aside, not related to what I've just said, but perhaps it's connected to some of the other things we're talking about with respect to nostalgia. Some people in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who would come to Maine every summer and often stay in the same place, and maybe had a house and maybe didn't, began referring to themselves as, many referred to themselves as summer natives. Now think about that for a moment as one way of dealing with Maine and incorporating yourself into Maine. It reminds me of the Connecticut license plate that I saw some years ago, and it was just a name, and the name was Pemaquid. There are people who have different there are outsiders who have different relationships to Maine than some simple category that we can come up with.
I just wanted to say, on this subject of this sort of relationship between sort of outsiders and insiders in Maine, and people from away and people traveling here, I was just really struck, Lisa, in your talk by the issue of disability and ill health, especially because I kept thinking about all of those people from away who viewed Maine as this place to which they could retreat to rebuild their health, right? In especially in the sort of ruggedness of the wild. And this was certainly practiced by a lot of urbanites, right, from the eastern cities, women and men. And so it was fascinating to me to see the way that Butler Hathaway complicates that narrative, because she's not seeking, a cure. She's really, she's really configuring this sort of space really differently in terms of her body and her health. I don't know if there's more in your project about that issue, but I'd love to hear it if so.
I don't know that there's that much more yet, but I do think, yes, no, I think your observation is totally on target, in that she is not looking for a cure. She's looking to live, right? She's not looking to be, and I think that's the point for her. Like, she understands, she comes with this baggage, and she's just looking for a way to be as liberated from it as possible. And strangely enough, finds it in a small town. But it's not strange, because when you start digging through, right, you find that there are all of these accommodations that are available that aren't, right? You don't, in New York City, in Greenwich Village, all of the bohemians, they are not going around carrying each other. They're not, there's no, you can't be a cool Parisian and hang out with Gertrude Stein and be carried up her steps, right? That's just not possible. So, but in in Castine and Blue Hill both, there's plenty of people who just do that for a living, right? There are all these people, mostly men, who are just used to it, and it's not a big deal. And she actually is then able to, in fact, normalize this chronic condition or set of conditions. I'm actually not sure exactly what she suffers from, but it seems that she suffers quite a lot. And because she's very small, she is easily brought around, driven, carried by native Maine men, and without an issue. Like, it's just that's what they do. So so actually it's Catherine Butler Hathaway that made me start thinking about, well, what do these places offer? Like, why are all of these people moving to Maine, right? And what really is there? The narratives aren't that necessarily that always that homogenous. And I think that that's one of the things that she shows us, that there are a lot of different opportunities that we don't necessarily ordinarily see. And I would be curious about, she was good friends, by the way, with Henry Beston and Elizabeth Coatsworth. I still don't know if she and Mary Ellen Chase ever met each other. They may have. They could have easily crossed paths many times. That is a side project of mine. I am trying to actually map the culture of mid-century Maine writers and artists. And they're so far, I can do a kind of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon with very few, with a lot of them. And Mary Ellen Chase is among them. And I'm just going to, since I have the soapbox, I'm going to take it one other place. And that is, I wanted to speak just briefly to Joe's point about Mary Ellen Chase retreating to Maine, where she felt she could be herself with her lover, who was a woman. And her name was Eleanor something, and I can't remember what it is.
Eleanor Shipley Duckett.
Duckett. Okay, thank you. And one of the things that I found for this mid-century Maine map is that there are many, particularly women couples living, and particularly all up and down the eastern seaboard there of Maine, particularly down east. And that is another submerged kind of set of narratives that we haven't really kind of adequately discussed. I don't mean tonight, but just in general. So that's something that I would like to work more on and make sure that we talk more about. And I do believe that it is this kind of comfort with, women living alternative lives that Maine offers, that does attract all of these women who are from away and who find lots of ways to make their way here, and their lives here, and including becoming part of town councils and select people, and like being integral parts of they're not just like hiding, they're so you all know that.
Lisa, I just wanted to say that the roads for your map are really in the archives, right? So all of these women and writers of that time were so prolific with their letter writing. And here we see all these connections. What was the letter I found in Elizabeth's archive that was something from Henry to, remember?
Well, there was stuff from Henry. There was stuff from Catherine Butler Hathaway.
I think she had written to him, or he had written to her in
Elizabeth's box. Yeah.
Anyway, it's so much fun digging in those archives. It's just anyone listening who's like needing a project. They're so full of wonderful things. I could just spend all day there. But I also wanted to circle back to what Jennifer said about Maine as a place of retreat for health purposes. Like, the pandemic now reminds us of that. For so long, we were like called the Switzerland of the United States. But this idea of rusticating goes way back to the beginning of the use of that verb, to take in the salt air or the mountain seas. And I was finding letters from Ware Mitchell, Yellow Wallpaper, his rest cure, sending people to Maine to take in the salt air and the fresh, cool water. So it's an old tradition that goes way back, and I hope that it continues in a healthy way. It's just interesting to consider the longevity of that narrative.
I see that Abby is asking about the parallels between Coatsworth travels being facilitated by the bodily labor of locals, and then Hathaway's life in Castine being made possible by the bodily help of locals. Yeah, I think that parallel is very manifest. That's like, yeah. I don't know, Ellen, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Coatsworth makes a point of naming how many coolies she has with her, or how many men are carrying her luggage. So while, I admire her proclivity to sleep in a hammock as opposed to a hotel bed, she did have help all around her. So, unapologetically. So it is really interesting that she relies on that help, and that part of that comes from her privilege, right? That she grew up with that, and she was never needed to dismiss it. Do you want to add on to that, Lisa?
No, I think you're absolutely there. That what enables these women to live audaciously and liberatorily is ultimately the bodies of less privileged people. I mean, that's just bottom line. It's true. Like, if I'm sure that if Catherine Butler Hathaway had, been able to afford to have people carry her around Greenwich Village, that she would have, but or maybe not. But I mean, but in Maine, labor is cheap, right? And the bodies of these men are it's cheap to buy. Like and the same thing for the bodies of coolies, and these privileged white women. I don't think I can't think of a moment, Ellen, you'll know more about Coatsworth, but I can't think of a moment in which Butler Hathaway ever, kind of, I think I only recall her, and maybe Abby, you know her oeuvre better than I do, but in my mind, she only is just like she just finds it a relief. I don't think she ever reflects on the politics of of that dynamic.
There is a letter, several letters that are in the archive. It's the archive again, that someone went back at some point and typed up a number of Coatsworth's letters. Thank you, whoever that was, because her writing takes a bit to get used to. And I'd seen the letters, and I found it later in this typed manuscript where during her travels in the East, and I'm sorry, I can't recall the geography exactly, but she came across at a port the site of hundreds of Chinese coolies in the bowels of a boat. I don't believe they were shackled, but they were like sardined in there, and she was haunted and horrified by this. And she tried to figure out where they were going, how long they had been, what was happening. So I don't think she was unreflective about it altogether. I think she was somewhat aware of her privilege, but that was an interesting piece buried in there, and one that would merit more discussion, particularly with Abby's illuminating question there.
And I just want to throw in Ellen Beaulieu's comment about thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt going over to Campobello through Eastport every summer as a summer native, managing her big family with a lot of help from local Maine people. So,
right. Well, Campobello and the Roosevelt is another piece of this puzzle in this map, maybe that Lisa's fixing.
Well, actually, yes, because on her way to Campobello, she stopped in Penobscot Bay, and I can't remember where. And actually, this is now far away in the recesses of my mind, so I can't remember. There is a Washington-based couple that were summer natives, two women that that Roosevelt kind of hung out with in Down East. Maybe, Kathleen, are you remembering who they are? No. Okay.
I can't remember the names either.
But you know who I'm talking about. Yeah. So I mean those. Yeah. So they're on my map, but I can't remember their names right now. Sorry.
Well, we are at 7 p.m. I am sorry to say, because you all have made these 2 hours fly by, and I am just so inspired now. So thank you, everyone. Lisa, did you have any final words as the UMA host entity?
No, only thank you so much, Kathleen and Jennifer, and also Ellen and Joe, and everybody for participating. That this is, in a moment in which everything is very difficult, this is a lovely thing to do. So I really, really appreciate everybody's efforts.
Yeah, I echo that. And thank you to everyone who came to listen and participate in that way. And if you have any thoughts on this map, this literary map in progress, now you know where to send them.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. It was lovely to see so many people join us and participate. And I just hope you all know you can reach out to the speakers or to us at the Women Writers Collection to continue the conversation or to plan some future research. So thank you very much, and everyone take care.
Thank you, Jennifer.